This Giant Acapulco is around 35 years old. It looks hardly used, and I picked it up for only $20. Let's jump right into the build and save this thing. First things first. Let's get this wheel off and start digging a little deeper into the mechanics of this time capsule. You can already see it's a bit gummed up, but hopefully we'll find some solid bones underneath all of this grime. Moving right along. Next step up is getting this old chain off the bike. Surprisingly, this old chain doesn't seem too bad at all. To save a bit of cost and to keep as much of the original hardware as possible, I'm going to carefully remove it, making sure not to push the pin all of the way out. That way we can easily rejoin it after a good cleaning. Time to tackle the crank arms. First step here is to remove the small dust cap. This exposes the main bolt that holds the crank arms onto the bottom bracket spindle. Now, for this bolt, I'm going to use a 14mm socket attached to my drill gun. This can really speed things up. There we go, both nuts off nice and quick. With the retaining nuts removed, we can now bring in the specialized tool for this job, the crank arm puller, designed specifically for square taper cranks like these. You can see how this tool threads into the crank arm itself, and the center bolt will push against the bottom bracket spindle. I'm going to slowly tighten down the crank puller, and you can feel it starting to apply pressure. And there they go, the crank arms have been removed. Alright, with the cranks out of the way, let's move on to the derailleurs, starting with the rear. These are usually held on by a single bolt along with the cable. I'm going to carefully detach the cable and loosen this bolt. And there we go, the rear derailleur is now free. I'll set this aside for cleaning and inspection later. Next up, the front derailleur. This one typically has a clamp around the seat tube and another cable to detach. I'll first detach the shift cable, then I'll loosen this clamp. And with the clamp removed, the front derailleur is off. One step closer to a bare frame. First up is detaching the straddle cable from the brake arms themselves. This releases tension on the entire system. With that loose, we can now shift our focus up to the handlebars and the brake levers. Here I'm going to pull on the housing to expose a length of cable so that it's easier to detach it from the brake lever. And with the cable detached, I can now move on to the shifters. Here I cut the cables. Now that the brake levers and shifters are cableless, we can remove them from the handlebars. First, I cut off the old grips using a razor blade. Then I move on to loosening the screw that holds the brake lever in place, then slide it off the handlebars. A similar method is used for removing the shifters. Next up, we move on to removing the stem and handlebars. I start by loosening the bolt on top of the stem, and then I use a hammer and my Allen key to bang on top of the stem to loosen the wedge. Here I am removing the bolt. I normally wouldn't do this, but I was following instructions from AI. You can see that video up here. As a result, the wedge was left stuck in the steerer tube. It's time to remove the brakes. I use my Allen key to unscrew the bolt holding the caliper to the frame. And finally, I use a zip tie to keep everything organized. It's now time to remove the fork and headset. We start by unscrewing the lock nut, followed by any spacers and the top bearing race. Once that's unscrewed, I can lower the fork and take out any bearings. On to the bottom bracket. I'll start on the non-drive side by removing the lock ring, followed by removing the non-drive side bearing cup. It's amazing after 35 years how easy this was to remove. Lastly, we'll move on to the drive side and remove that bearing cup as well. With the removal of the bottom bracket, that completes disassembly of the frame, and I can move on to inspecting and cleaning all of the parts. The first step in reassembling the spike is to install the fork and headset. To do this, we first grease the bearing cups, install the bearings, slide the fork into place, screw on the top bearing race, install any spacers, and finally install the lock nut. For the bottom bracket installation, I like to put a lot of grease on the threads. This helps with cup removal later on. Before I install the drive side bearing cup, I need to apply a generous amount of grease and then the bearings. Remember that the drive side cup is reverse threaded and we must turn left to tighten. Let's move on to the non-drive side. First step is to install the spindle. Just like with the drive side, the non-drive side cup gets a generous amount of grease, followed by the bearings. This cup has right-hand threading, so it screws on righty-tighty. With this cup, you want to tighten it down just so. Not too tight, not too loose. You want to make sure there's no play in the spindle. Now we install a lock ring that'll hold everything in place. You can tighten the lock ring down like this. Let's get started with installing the crank arms. The first step I usually do is apply a very light coat of grease to the spindle. Next, I'll slide the appropriate crank arm over the spindle and attach the nut and tighten it down as tight as I can get it. We'll repeat this process for the other side. Be sure to orient the crank arms correctly. Now it's time to install the derailleurs. We'll install the rear derailleur with a 9mm bolt. And we'll move on to the front derailleur. We'll make sure we align it parallel to the chain rings and at the right height. With the derailleurs installed, we can move on to installing the chain. The first step is to route the chain correctly through the rear derailleur, followed by routing the chain through the front derailleur and over the chain ring, and finally I'll join the chain together with my chain tool. Don't forget to lubricate your chain. When done, wipe off any excess. I do it like this. To install the cantilever brakes, I first apply a light coating of grease to the brake bosses. I then attach the appropriate arm to the right or left hand side and screw it down with a bolt. I repeat the process for the other side. The process is identical for the front brakes. Let's make this thing start to look like a bicycle again. We'll start by installing the rear wheel. I'll slide it into the dropouts and around the chain. And finally, I'll tighten the bolts on the right and left. For the front wheel, we'll lift it up through the fork and into the dropouts and tighten the quick release skewer. Now we're getting to the exciting part. We're installing the first shifter. I start by sliding the shifter over the handlebar and placing it in a position and tightening down the screw. Now that we have the shifter in place, I can install a fresh cable. I'm reusing the old cable housing and will route the cable towards the rear derailleur. Now we slide the cable through the derailleur and attach it. We're ready for testing. And to my surprise, shifting was almost perfect on the first try. Now for the front shifter. I slide it on and attach it, and just like the rear shifter, it gets a new cable. We use the existing cable housing and route the cable towards the front derailleur. This shifter uses friction shifting, so there's no adjustment needed here. It's now time to install the brake levers. I'll slide them onto the handlebars to the appropriate location and tighten them down. These will also get fresh cables installed. I'll use the old brake housing and route the cable towards the rear cantilever brakes. I'll now install the straddle cable. The brake cable gets attached to the straddle cable, and we fine-tune things. Now we move on to the front. The brake levers are installed on the handlebar in the appropriate position. and a fresh cable is installed, and we use the existing cable housing to route the cables to the front brakes. The straddle cable is installed, and the brake cable is attached to the straddle cable, and finally things are dialed in. And to wrap things up, I'll be installing new grips. I'll use rubbing alcohol to lubricate the handlebars so the grips slide on easy. If you made it this far, you're a true champion. If you enjoyed this video, show that thumbs up button some love and subscribe for more bicycle restoration content.